Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape pod bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. Last month, June 2019, saw planning and the visions and aspirations of the country put into sharp focus when President Ramaphosa delivered his State of the Nation address. It's commonly known here in South Africa as the Sonar Address, and really sets the tone for the government for the year ahead. Talk of a new city driven by the fourth wave of an industrial revolution was the cornerstone feature of the President's address that day. And there was quite an immediate reaction and response that varied from different corners. SACPlan, or the South African Planning Council, widely applauded the speech and went on in a press release to suggest that never in the life of a democratic state has such attention been accorded to planning-related matters and with such clarity. Conversely, we saw an open letter communicated via the Daily Maverick from three emeritus professors, Dave Dewar, Julian Cook, and Lucien Lagrange from UCT, and they were supported by a number of other professionals and academics who were quick to counter that, to quote, mending our ailing existing cities is far more urgent than that of a new smart city. So there's tension and different thinking and approaches that are being put forward by different players. The President's put his perspective forward, people have responded to that, and planning is very much up front and centre in the debate, and that's precisely why Talking Transformation is being produced, to continue the debate and consider multiple perspectives that exist and recognise that there's not going to be one size that fits all. This week, for our fifth full episode, our guest is Dr. Geshe Karuri Sabina, who is visiting the Western Cape. Her insights into the Sonar Address and more broadly some of the challenges we face in the built environment professions and the education system that supports it makes for very much a very interesting and compelling listening. I hope you enjoy it and look forward to getting feedback from you via the voice message link that the Anchor podcast platform provides, or via our Twitter page at Talking Transfo 1. That's the Talking Transfo, all in word, and the number 1. I'm here today, this afternoon. I'm recording from Cape Town Central Business District. I'm with my colleague Geshe Karuri Sabina, who I've known for many years. I'm guessing maybe 10 or more years we've known each other, and I've asked her to come in today to really think and reflect back on some of the announcements that were made a couple of weeks ago in the State of the Nation address. State President Ramaphosa was very clear in terms of his intent around a new city that was going to be built on the basis of the fourth technical industrial revolution. And when we were chatting yesterday, I think you had some very interesting perspectives, Geshe. So I thought it would be great to come in terms of this Talking Transformation podcast and start to think about some of those ideas that he put forward and how we could look at that within the frame of your experience within many of the cities and towns around the country. You have for many years been associated with cities, South African Cities Network and other, I think, Human Sciences Research Council. You've been around, you understand cities. I think you're one of the leading proponents of understanding urbanization, what it is and how it's taking us. So maybe just an immediate reflection on some of those sentiments that the state president was sharing with the country a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. It's really great to be on your podcast. This is amazing. I'm very privileged.
Thank you for coming.
So, initially, I suspect, like many of us in the urban space, I was quite delighted that the president was going into content on the urban. Many of us have been trying to advocate around the importance of cities and urbanization for a long time. Around 2016, when the Integrated Urban Development Framework was finally promulgated, at least it gave us an urban policy that was recognized, but again, it was probably familiar mainly to people in the urban space. It wasn't so much in the public consciousness as, oh, this is a really important issue. Instead, a lot of what you've tended to get are those kind of dramatic statements about cities are exploding, bursting at the seams, we've got to stop people from moving.
Major urbanization rates, immigration,
exactly.
etc.
As a very negative narrative,
Yeah.
Almost an anti-urban narrative. And I'm always sensitive to the fact that rural development is a real issue, but obviously cities are a going concern. And so it was initially, as the president started making this statement, for me, I was like, wow, great, he's actually going to say something about cities. So for the buzz it's created, for the awareness it's created about cities, I think great. Unfortunately, I think perhaps the particular sentiments and the particular examples he chose to then go into, I think are really highly problematic. And I think for a few of us, and it's interesting because I think part of the buzz that's picked up is people, and I've read a number of articles the last few days commenting on this. Do we need new cities? What is this smart cities thing? Are we ready for it? What is this thing about 4IR and cities? Is that the future? High-speed rail, is that what we really need? Are we the Dubai of the future? Is this really the vision for South Africa? And I really feel as though there were perhaps some judgments made in the kind of examples given for the urban vision that I think are problematic, and in a way, if we're not careful, I think could really divert a lot of the energy from what many of us believe ought to be the agenda and are the things we've all been working very hard at, only to suddenly have what I fear might be a very sort of exciting and alluring narrative, that just diverts attention from what really needs to be done, at least in my view.
Well, I guess there's sort of two sides to the coin. I mean, on the one side, commentators, and I think what I'm hearing you say is it's not necessarily helpful when certain of the cities are struggling with some very basic issues around infrastructure, rail issues. If we're going to talk about bullet trains,
yes.
We're seeing a situation where some of our backbone of the rail network that exists is really struggling. That said, Gautrain, I think, has been one of the testimonials to that. It can be done. It can change the way that some of our cities operate. So the flip side of the coin is others who might be supporting those aspirations are saying, well, you've got to have a dream, you've got to have a vision. And so I guess somewhere in between is it's how do you deal with that reality whilst at the same time maintaining this idea of a vision of hope and aspiration?
I love the idea of a dream and a vision, but I think that if we're just going to borrow a dream and a vision from somewhere else, again, I just said if this is about us becoming Dubai, then I'm not sure that's the dream or vision we ought to be selling. I wish we would sell an urban vision that's compelling and exciting for South Africans, but why can't that be about the amazing integrated city that we all dreamed about in 1994? Why can't that be a compelling vision? Why can't a compelling vision include a functioning metro rail? Why does it have to be a Gautrain? Why can't a compelling vision be for a kind of urban typology that we actually like, that perhaps gives us the densities that we planners like to talk about, but also meets the aspiration of young urban dwellers? Why can't there be a vision that's relevant?
Very interesting. I mean, the Integrated Urban Development Framework, or IUDF, seems to be very clear in terms of using, for example, public transportation as leverage and the backbone around which to restructure our cities. And yet at the same time, as you say, that some of the fundamentals are failing. We've seen major investments in things like bus rapid transit around some of the metros. And I mean, even those have got their own challenges, whether it's operational costs and the ability to roll out at scale. You've spent quite a lot of time in your recent work researching and leading on the debate around South African cities and some of the smaller secondary towns and so forth. What do you think some of the prevailing challenges above and beyond the infrastructure, like the rail that we talked about? What do you think some of these challenges are that you've seen and experienced in your time with South African Cities Network?
Yeah. So look, there's some that I would say are in common between the large sort of metros and secondary cities, largely around demographic stagnation, perhaps, around some of particularly the spatial kind of patterns that we have, which some would argue, and I've seen the work that talks about actually there's been massive change, but many of us know that we still continue to have that sort of township versus core densification through informalization kind of dynamic. And so there's a lot about our historic organization that I think is a challenge for both big cities and smaller ones, because you still distinctly see those spatial characteristics, so that spatial quality. or lack of spatial quality. But I think another big one, interestingly, is the dynamics of change. So I think migration is a big one, and many of us aren't well equipped to deal with it. I think arrangements, I would call institutional arrangements that haven't been able to respond adequately to those changes. So one of the comments, I commented earlier about, I really dislike narratives about urban explosion and bursting at the seams, because the one thing cities can do very well is to grow.
There's a sponginess to them.
Exactly. I mean, that's, it's one of the most city-ish things that we could celebrate, and that I think that's really universal. But if institutions don't themselves understand that need to be agile and to be responsive to dynamics and maybe even directive, then I think you've got a problem. So I think we've misread the situation. We can't control the movement of people. I mean, how many times have you moved, Peter, in your life?
Enough.
And
enough.
Is that because, there are many reasons why people move. I've moved enough in my life as well. And so this idea that the perfect situation is where we get everybody to just stay put so that we can plan around them.
So there's a churn as well as a pace that comes with that intensity of movement.
Cities do that. Cities grow, cities change, and we can do that too. So I think that's difficult both for the biggest cities, because they really are bigger than they've ever been, and that's difficult. I think it's difficult for the secondary cities, and we're just releasing next week another study in a series we've been doing on secondary cities, and this one is on how secondary cities understand economic development, because I think their challenge is that many of them still function like small towns in spite of the fact that they're really quite significantly growing or significant sized economies, in fact. So I think there's some issues around that, again, in terms of institutional growth and adaptation to the reality of what they are. But those changes aren't only upward changes. So one of the things we've done over time is to compare what's been going on in a place like Rustenburg that grew fast and grew under maybe difficult environmental, political, economic circumstances into what it is now, but that's really got to look ahead quite seriously and quite urgently to the change in the industry that underpins the growth. And then places like Welkom, which is a secondary city in decline, that if you were to read its document, seems not to recognize this, because all the documents continue and the plans continue to refer to it as a growth story.
When in fact things are fundamentally changing within the economy that was going to set them back. And
so cities grow and cities become smaller. And so this idea of being a shrinking city, and maybe the opportunities that might bring, completely bypass you if you continue to describe your city the way you always have described your city.
It's really interesting you're raising that, because in one of the earlier podcasts when we spoke to Yondella, Yondella Silamela, who has just moved to Paris and is going to be working in Eastern Europe, she was talking about this whole question of de-densification of some of the cities. And normally when we've talked in these metropolitan contexts, that de-densification is not even something we even imagine, other than de-densification of a particular informal settlement. So it's almost getting your head around that. And here you are, a couple of weeks on, talking about it's actually happening here in South Africa, and it's very easy to forget that. What I also found very interesting, a couple of years ago when we were looking at this at a more national space, was this idea of those secondary cities and towns, the growth, and in percentage terms, the growth of the top 5, in fact, I think it was the top 15 of our municipalities. None of the metros were in that space in the percentage terms. Yeah. So we started to see places like Swartland, Gamagara, and others hitting very high levels of annual growth, coming off particularly low base. But I think Joburg and Tshwane were in that number 15 and 16 or something. Sure. So again, it's this idea of where things are happening and the pace of change and where the economy is playing that role. It's having a direct increase or decrease in urbanization rates.
And I mean, so true. And one of the things, in fact, when we began this series, the first study we did was a data-driven study that tried to study some of those dynamics, because there was already, I think, going back to maybe 2010, 2011, 2012, an emerging a query around secondary cities and rapidly growing secondary cities. And so we did this data-driven study to get those stats. And indeed, you do find that you have these really rapidly growing smaller places. As you correctly mentioned, of course, it's off a very low base. Sure. And so one has to understand that. What I find is that, first of all, in the public understanding of what that rapid growth means, sometimes people exaggerate it to think that we have new Joburgs and new Cape Towns growing everywhere. And then you have to remind people that the base is so small that even with the rapidest growth, you're not talking about major new metropolitan areas popping up around the country. The big six are still the big six, and that isn't
and
changing
probably will
soon.
remain so for some time. But we should be keeping our eyes wide open.
Then that's my second point. As we keep our eyes wide open on understanding this rapid growth of smaller places, I'm not sure that we as planners, we as policymakers have really gotten our heads around what that means. And I think it's partly why we're doing these exploratory studies, is to understand that, okay, so if you're growing that fast as a small place, not because we think you're going to be a metro, but as a small place growing that fast, there's a role you're playing in the space economy. So clearly there's a role, whether it's in terms of absorbing population, some sort of economic thing is happening, there's service issues. So there's something that's happening there. But what does that mean? What does that something happening mean in terms of what an institutional response ought to be?
Governance frameworks, scaling up around supply chain, and to be able to respond. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing we want is, again, we like dichotomizing things in South Africa, is begin to have a, swing this way or that. Does it mean stop supporting metros, support secondary cities, or rural versus urban? We like creating these polarities. I just hope that that's not where it's headed. But certainly there's some attention that needs to be given to this phenomenon of rapid growth.
Well, let's bring it back to the question of this new city, new city to be built to accommodate the fourth technical revolution. I find it very interesting when my observation in many of the metros has been that a lot of the development is happening in spite of any planning regime, in spite of any formal arrangements. The informal sector in accommodation, burgeoning backyard accommodation, increased informal settlement and the densification of existing long-established informal settlements seems to be playing a massive role. And I think that was, from my side, one of the things that perhaps the President's speech didn't reflect well enough on, was this idea that the fourth economy will solve everything. It doesn't really help you if you don't even have access to electricity or internet. And what's the fourth tech revolution going to do for you in those circumstances? So maybe some reflections you might have on this idea of a formal versus informally driven growth of our cities and towns.
Yeah. Look, I think informality is something South Africa has struggled to come to terms with for a long time. And I think it's even fairly recent that, I think it's very recent, in fact, that in some of the formal spaces that you and I are in, Peter, that people even talk about it as something that's not just illegal. I remember a few years ago having officials say, why are we even talking about backyarding? It's illegal. And so then that wasn't long ago. So
it isn't, you're right.
Yeah, so I think we're fessing up to our informality much later than most of Africa, because I guess we are stuck in this in-between world where we, I think, probably were ashamed of it, and we're very much in we'll get rid of it sort of mode for the longest.
Eradicate informal settlements. That was the wording, correct?
That's right, eradicate informal settlements. Backyard shacks are illegal. Got to clear them out. The informal traders are illegal traders. So that narrative, I think, very recently, was really the prevalent narrative. So a narrative that now begins to say that actually the informal settlement is contributing X% to our economic growth, or the informal sector is the only one creating jobs in the last quarter,
or supplying accommodation,
at
the rate around which we expect.
And how could we do more of this? This is all quite recent, and I think it's important that we admit to that. I think, and I remember part of that negative narrative around informality was also posited as, I guess, a post-apartheid kind of, if you remember the language about dignity. So that meant that you were accepting a lack of dignity and less than, for black people, obviously, if you're supporting, so we can't have this because not only is it illegal, it's indignified, and it's almost inhumane for us to be accepting this. That narrative is shifting slowly. I don't think it's shifted altogether, as we know, and many of our cities continue to struggle with that. Institutionally, I don't think. So recently we did some work with Salga where there's a great piece of work that's probably going to go through the motions now through Salga structures in terms of beginning to create a policy view for how local government could think about informality, some sort of a floor, some sort of a platform on which local policy could be built up. Now, many of the cities have been doing. Cape Town's been thinking about this. Joburg has, but many of us still don't quite have an enabling, if you want, policy infrastructure because we don't have a sound policy position actually on the issue of informality. So the IUDF acknowledges that we've got to think about the informal sector, but isn't obviously making any policy statement on this is what we think is the position of the informal sector in
Understood.
our housing sector or our transport sector or our economy. So that's difficult. And I think that's part of the journey we have to travel. But I also think that, we also use these words like co-creation and co-production, and we want to work with the grassroots and without perhaps appreciating how difficult, number one, that is, and maybe asking the question about capacity on both sides. What's the capacity of public institutions that we occupy now to engage meaningfully with the grassroots in general and with an informal sector of any kind? And then what's the capacity on that side to engage with a state as well? These are conversations, by the way, in other African countries that have been going on forever.
Sure. So we're not unique, is what you're saying.
We're not unique. In fact, we might even be behind the curve on some of this. Yeah.
It does beg some questions around the sort of professional response. If I think about the built environment professions, but architects, planners, engineering standards and so forth, it might need a rethink on some of that. Any thoughts on that in terms of how we go about skilling at greater numbers?
So this is a big deal for me. So obviously there's some of the scholars both you and I know that have been working on whether it's informal housing or informal work for many years. But they're few and far between, which is why we can count them on our hands. And it's been the same people who've been doing it. So it's the same handful of people who've been doing that work. I'm very passionate. So one of my passion topics, as you might know, is townships and township developments, only because I think they've been so under-theorized, over-described, under-theorized, and underdeveloped, of course. And one of my passions, once I began doing my PhD, and to my surprise, realized that there was such little robust scholarship on the subject. And I thought, how is this possible? What could be more important to study in South Africa if you're in a planning school or in an architecture school or in any developmental program than studying this phenomenon of the fact that we've got these places? And yet, when I then start going through the scholarship, I'm searching the thesis, I'm looking at the masters, I'm looking at the PhDs, there were really few, and this really bothered me. And so one of the things I've been trying to do since then, and we're trying to do through Cities Network, possibly with UJ and others that are interested, is to develop a program on what we call it the Township Economies Knowledge Support Program, and one of its key anchors is building the scholarship as the academic program. I'm of the belief, and I'm one of the people, perhaps rightly or wrongly, who've been very positive about the whole decolonize movement, particularly when it comes to talking about curriculum, because I'm keen for us to think about what that means and what that might look like. I think we need to decolonize the planning academy.
Right.
And in fact, I would maybe even broaden it to the built environment, maybe even the development disciplines. So one of the things we've been doing through Cities Network and speaking to other partners is thinking about this knowledge support program around townships. And one of its key anchors would be a program that focuses on academic development. And the idea is just to grow the volume of scholarship. It's to say that we've got masses of young people going into these university programs every year. How is it that, with that sort of, throughput, that pipeline that's going in, I would imagine a good proportion of those kids, if nothing else, come from townships. Let's assume people are just not interested in that as subject matter, but that's where you're coming from. What is it that must happen for all of you to come in and think that you should study anything other than all of the challenges you've grown up seeing? What is it that happens? Is it that you get convinced that other things are more important? Is it that there's nobody able to advise and comment, or you feel comfortable speaking to about what you think the problem is? Is it that your interests are different? And I can understand that. I mean, people may want to go and study other things, but really, I mean, out of any particular year, from the volume of scholarship I've seen, it can't be more than one or two who's ever bothered to study townships. So there's something there we've got to intervene into. There are all sorts of programs at universities. I'm at WITS right now. There's a big Life in Cities program. There's no Life in Townships program. There are very few of the big academic names we know who would probably lift up their hand to say that I will supervise any students who want to do township studies.
That's really interesting, Geshe.
I couldn't find supervision when I was looking.
So I was about to say, is the problem not that there are not enough mentors? And what does that raise in terms of a question for professional bodies, for the academics, and for people like yourself and myself who've been involved for many years to say, well, this is a gap. If we don't fill it, we've got a problem.
And that's the question I think we all have to ask ourselves. And so for me, my commitment was to say, well, I'm interested, I'm unhappy with the situation, and therefore I'll make my time available. And I've been trying to make sense of what that means. So part of what we want to do is to see whether we can start a program that first of all valorizes this as a useful and important area of study, maybe tries to put some instruments in place like these scholarship calls and bursaries that are themed, and to say, well, this is a theme as well. Yeah. But importantly, putting in the mentors and people who are willing to take the time to supervise. So I've been very clear with the two institutions I'm working with that the kinds of students I want to work with are the kinds of students that are studying these kinds of issues. Right. One of the responses I got is that the challenge sometimes is that those might be, for various historic and current reasons, some of the weaker students. And so my question was, do you mean they're weaker intellectually, or do you mean they're weaker in the sense that, okay, maybe they don't write great? And usually it's the latter.
Yeah, I can understand that, yeah.
And so if you're not intellectually stunted, if you actually can do the work, you have the ideas, you have the lived experience, you have the passion, then I think we've got to find among us people who think it's important enough, in spite of our comfort or discomfort around the subject matter. I mean, I'm born in Nairobi. What am I doing supervising people on studying South African townships?
Well, you're very welcome.
Thank you. I think we've got to find among us the people who are willing to make the time.
You've recently been facilitating a week in Cape Town with a whole range of different countries and urbanization experiences that have been shared. Perhaps some of your reflections on what surprised you, what's inspired you, what's some of your take-home points after 4 or 5 days here in Cape Town, but sharing a whole range of experiences with people from as diverse places, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, in Colombia, through Medellin, and China. We've had a whole range. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts after an exhausting week of facilitating, not so?
Yes, but I mean, really exciting. I mean, you're mentioning, all of these really interesting and quite diverse cities from around the world being here. And, the first thing that strikes you is, and I think the way we curated the learning journey was quite important because, we started off, as from this, silo precinct in the waterfront, which impressed everybody to no end. The Chinese delegation hasn't stopped talking about it.
It's difficult not to be impressed, but by God, where are we going to find the money?
Hey, I mean, so if that could be rolled out across the territory, I think everybody would be delighted.
You don't have a spare 100 million, was it, for the penthouse?
I didn't bring it today, sorry.
Oh, okay. Next week.
Then perhaps next week. So, I mean, going from that to then spending time in the CBD itself and talking about the partnership approaches that the city's been trying to work with here, and then moving on to Khayelitsha, where we then spent a day in the Harare node looking at that. I think that progression doesn't shock me, and maybe wouldn't shock many South Africans, because we've almost gotten used to these extremes.
Perhaps come numb at times.
But, I mean, it was obviously shocking to the delegates, and I think many of them, as you heard, made comments around, it almost feels like it's two different places.
Two different cities. We've heard that described a couple of times this week.
Several times, yeah, two different places. So what I wouldn't, obviously that doesn't surprise me so much, I know this, but, I was last in Khayelitsha on this particular tour maybe 10 years ago. And I'm in Cape Town fairly regularly, more or less in the CBD usually, not so much the waterfront. And what struck me in part was how little has changed. And I find Cape Town beautifully tragic, quite frankly. It's just such a beautiful place and such a cool place, and I can understand why everybody from the world wants to be here. Yep. But you spend a little bit of time here, and you feel a little bit like you're in fairyland, where everything is both beautiful and hideous, because you're struck constantly about these extremes. You're struck constantly about how you could be here and be completely oblivious to it. So, I went to get some dinner the other day and just walking in the neighborhood where I'm staying. And, they're lovely little cafes and quirky little places, and it's very cool. And you can see young people and it's vibey, but it's a particular demographic and it's very clear. And, also the stories you hear about the experience of young black professionals in Cape Town. For me, walking around as a black person, I really saw and felt it. You'll see all of maybe 2 or 3 black people, and it'll be a particular kind of black person that you'll see. And it's certainly not the experience of being in Khayelitsha. And it's not just that it's a spatially, the spatial quality of the place is different. The place is fundamentally different. I don't even think it's 2 different cities. It's almost 2 different planets. And I don't know this is not a faulting, this is not an accusation against the administration of Cape Town. I just don't know what one does about this. But I've been coming to Cape Town, in fact, since 1998. I was teaching at UWC at the time. I used to come and guest lecture there. And I was coming from out of the country. And I remember back then being confronted in 2000 when my husband and my then boyfriend and I decided to move to South Africa, and we were choosing cities, where would we live? And I remember being very clear that it couldn't be Cape Town. And this is in 2000. And the reason was, in a way, exactly this. I realized I'd have to be very deliberate about where I chose to live, in a way that I don't have to worry as much in Gauteng, actually. We ended up in Pretoria, where it really doesn't matter where you live. It's a very strange place. But in Cape Town, a simple thing like that, where you choose to reside, in a way almost begins to determine the nature of the bubble you'll then live in. And so I find Cape Town, I must say, very beautiful but very disturbing.
I mean, you embody the notion of the global citizen. Home is Nairobi, varsity, if I understood correctly, UCLA,
yes.
In Los Angeles. Work very much based for the last 10 or so years in and around Gauteng. Thousands of miles separate these places. Maybe broadening the horizons. We've talked a bit about Cape Town and your time here. But let's look further beyond. Let's look at some of those other places and spaces you've occupied. Maybe some, many of our listeners might not have been to some of these places. Would you like to share some thoughts on these other places that you've spent time? Nairobi, we've heard a lot about that this week.
Yeah. Look, so the three places you mentioned, so cities in South Africa, Nairobi in Kenya, Los Angeles in California. There are a couple of commonalities across them. So these are obviously very big, very urban places, fairly developed, I suppose. Today this week we've spent with cities like Monrovia in Liberia, which obviously are a very different kind of urban, but these others are very cosmopolitan, fairly developed places, and I've loved them. I think I really am truly urban in that sense, because these are places that are intense, that are diverse, that are problematic in very similar sorts of ways. All of them, crime and security is like part of the DNA. Those kinds of challenges, lots to do, and the intensity around that, lots of contestation and conflict, which again characterizes a lot of cities, lots of change, but a richness, a quality that I really, really love and have I wouldn't say I get high on it, but I think it's almost something that I need to have. And I think for me particularly the diversity. So whether it's Los Angeles, which has all of these layers of, large Asian community, large African American community, large, obviously American, other groups there, a large Hispanic community, and just it's an amazing space to be in.
A melting pot.
It's much more complicated than a melting pot. If they melted, it might be easier. But just having to be part of that and to learn that and to delve into it and to smell it and to stay with the trouble to some extent, because it is. A lot of cultural diversity equals trouble, and so that's been amazing. Joburg's been amazing for exactly the same reasons. I love Joburg. Love Joburg. There's a lot that I don't love about Joburg. LA too. Nairobi maybe less culturally diverse than these others, but also a very diverse and intense city. So a lot of people go there and talk about maybe just the traffic, but also a lot of people, and increasingly a lot of South Africans have been going there. It's just the best social life you could have. The nightlife, the kind of the vibe. I almost have to sleep more before I go there, because I know I'll be getting home at 6 a.m.
So this is the Nairobi, the party city, according to Geshi, right?
Okay. Party city. Okay. I actually sometimes wonder how people manage to work there, because, but also, just socially, people are really cool, and I love.
It certainly seems to have a very particular vibe about it, from what I've heard.
You must go with me, and then I can show you around.
I tell you, by the sounds of it, I'll need a good weekend to sleep it off as well.
Yeah, look, but again, straddled with very similar problem. The traffic really is hideous. The ability of the city to keep up with its growth, the kind of culture of building regulation or sticking to plans is really problematic. So lots of challenges, lots of solutions that aren't solutions that have been happening over the last few years. Building these massive freeways and bypasses to expand road capacity and reduce traffic, which of course it never does, and many of us know this. So lots of those kinds of environmental issues galore, but still amazing places that I think really have the innovative and human capacity to work their way out of it. So maybe that's one thing I'd leave with you is that I feel that part of the challenge with Cyril's statements were, it sounded like more of this idea that we could build our way out of problems. I don't think that's the process of urban development that we need, one that tries to lead with stuff. I love tech, and on another podcast, I hope we do talk. I mean, I talk about tech all the time. I talk about tech and innovation. I don't think tech or innovation is going to help us escape the trouble we're in. I don't think infrastructure is going to help us escape the trouble we're in. I don't think new cities or bullet trains will do it either. I think people could. I think people will. But we've got to invest in that. We've got to invest in, first of all, believing in the fact that we've got the intellectual and the passion and the human capacity to do something different from what we've done, that there are many more people who can and need to be brought into the process of this, and we've got to trust that. I believe we've got to build the capabilities and focus people on the issues that need focus and not distract them with funny projects. I think we've got to stand up to where capital does things that don't work in the interest of the majority. I think there's a lot that we could do that's really on the level of understanding new processes that are needed in how we think about our cities. That's what I believe in.
Keshi, I mean, I really appreciate some of your thinking and reflection on this. I'm going to move towards a summary, and I'm going to ask one last question, and then a final push from your side. Do you think we missed an opportunity in the rethink around the cabinet of not looking at something like a Ministry of Cities? I know Brazil, I think, has gone down that route before. Here we are talking about a new city, in the absence of the existing. Do you think we might have missed an opportunity here?
Yeah, so I'm of mixed minds about it. I think we might have missed an opportunity because I do think that continuing to have the issue of cities covered within a department like COGTA, and then several of the key functions related to that being split up elsewhere. I mean, for crying out loud, the issue of land is now not only in a Department of Rural Development, but of Agriculture and Rural Development. And that's one of the most fundamental levers we've got to work with if we're going to crack this issue of cities. So that's really problematic. The fact that some of the competence and understanding in this area sits in DPME and some of it sits in the DHS, the fact that DHS human settlements is so politicized, and we all know this and we continue to accept that, which means there's another lever there that we can't really work. The fact that, water sanitation is there and transport's, there. So part of me thinks that a Ministry of Cities at least would have forced us to think and act in a more integrated way politically, and then definitely administratively as well. But look, I mean, I've done some work that's included looking at Brazil and India and ourselves in terms of these issues, and they have their own stories about whether the Ministry of Cities works either as a solution. So I don't know that that's the solution, but I think we needed to have done something.
Fair enough, and I say that I really appreciate you considering that question. The podcast that we've tried to put together is really about inspiring the current and next generation of both professionals and activists, those people who are working in and around built environment issues, whether it's from the communities or within institutions. And perhaps as a parting shot from your side, is there any message at the moment? I think we're all struggling with a whole range of issues and challenges, and communities directly being impacted by things like whether it's army interventions, whether it's lack of sanitation, whether it's not having a home, not having a job, or whether it's from our side saying, how do you get a job? How do we put homes on the ground? Any message for the listeners from your side, based on your experience and where you're at in your own professional career?
Yeah. Look, I think it's really hard to be, I'll say planner, but take that as shorthand for other built environment professionals as well. I think it's a difficult time for us now for several reasons. Many of us are trained in a very deterministic field that makes us believe that things are going well when our plan's coming to fruition. The plan is working. And that's the tradition we're trained in. That's the discipline we're trained in. And we're obviously in a time where we are not the determinant of what happens, and the plan isn't even the determinant of what happens. And it's easy, I think, to get quite despondent and quite frustrated. And a lot of what I see and feel in the space right now in many of our cities and many of our administrations is a lot of deep frustration and a lot of introspection, and not necessarily of a generative nature, not the sort that breeds inspiration.
Sure.
And I think my message of inspiration, I guess, would be that maybe we need to realize, a good friend of mine, Bayo Akomolefe, talks about, at some stage you may realize that the promised road doesn't lead where you thought. And once you come to that realization that the problem is not necessarily the road, the problem is that you thought, and maybe you were trained to believe, that this was all about a destination that you would get to, and being the brilliant planner you are, you're going to make that happen. Once you recognize that there isn't a promised land that this road is leading to, part of what he talks about is this idea that you should recognize that there are many other paths, and they're not only left, right, and backwards, they're also downwards. He talks about sinking into the cracks. So it's a bit of an abstract idea, but I find it, for me, where I am right now, oddly comforting. This idea that let's not get paralyzed by the fact that our road doesn't seem to be leading to the destination we thought. Maybe we're exactly where we're supposed to be. And maybe we need to make sense of that. And so perhaps the retreat then is not a retreat into depression and frustration about everything we see, but maybe it's a chance for us to really regroup, think, be where we are, sink into the cracks for a bit. These days people say stay with the trouble. And really reflect. And who knows? I mean, maybe beautiful things come out of where we are. I mean, that's my hope. Otherwise, honestly, one can get extremely hopeless. And I don't know that that's helpful as a professional. I don't know if it's helpful as a scholar or a practitioner, because I do see a lot of despondence around me. I think it can be deeply soul destroying. And I would want people, particularly young people, young professionals, to believe that maybe this is all just more complex than we thought. Stick with it. And we're not alone. Several of us, I think, you're doing this podcast. I think this is amazing. I think this is you sinking into your cracks.
Could well be.
And I think more of us perhaps need to get into this reflective mode rather than just a sort of a depressed and I'm out of here kind of mode.
Keshi, on that note, thank you so much for spending some time with us. I really have enjoyed hearing your thoughts, hearing your reflections, and hopefully in a year or so, maybe we get you back, we reflect on where we're at, and we keep the conversation going. All the very best. Enjoy the rest of your time with us in Cape Town and travel safely.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it.
Get involved, get informed, and most importantly, get subscribed. You can find us on our Twitter feed at Talking Transfo and the number 1. That's Talking Transfo 1. Talking Transformations music kindly supplied by Tribal Need. Find them at tribalneed.com.